بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد الصادق الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن استنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد فيقول الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه الكريم بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم واستبقا الباب وقدت قميصه من دبر وألفيا سيدها لدى الباب قالت ما جزاء من أراد بأهلك سوءا إلا أن يسجن أو عذاب أليم صدق الله العظيم. Alhamdulillah, we are now at ayah 25 in this surah, and inshallah we cover ayah 25, 26 and 27 bi'idhnillah in today's class. And this ayah that I just recited can be translated as they both raced for the door, and she tore his shirt from behind, and they met her Lord at the door. She said, what is the punishment of he who intends evil for your wife other than imprisonment or a painful torment? Exploring the tafsir of this verse, we have to answer a few questions. Number one, which door was it? Number two, did Zulaykha tear the shirt of Sayyidina Yusuf purposely, or was it done inadvertently? And number three, if she was so in love with Yusuf, so enamored by him, why, when she met her husband at the door, did she suggest imprisonment for Yusuf or a painful torment, if she's so enamored by him? So let's go back a little bit. We've read already how Zulaykha had adorned herself, and how before that she was suggesting things and speaking with a certain innuendo, and she decked herself out in fine attire and tried to seduce him. And we know that his response was twofold. The first part of the response was to seek refuge in Allah, ma'adh Allah. He sought refuge in Allah. And the second step he took was to try to get himself out of the situation. He tried to take active steps to physically remove himself from that predicament. And unlike the previous verses where we see Zulaykha taking the initiative, we see in the previous verses, she is the one who had the desire to seduce. She is the one who adorned herself. She is the one who made suggestions. قالت هيت لك. She took the initiative in all of these steps. But here we see that he took the initiative to get out of the situation, to extricate himself from this attempted seduction. So he tries to leave. Now the verse says, istabaqa al-bab, using the dual form, which means that both of them were racing or running towards the door. However, we see that the intention of Yusuf was to get out of the situation, and the intention of Zulaykha was to prevent him from leaving altogether. So the racing or the running was in the dual form. They were both running to the door, both racing to the door, but their intentions were completely different. Now, when we go back to the other ayah 23, we remember how Allah describes her as having locked multiple doors. وَغَلَّقَتِ الْأَبْوَابِ. She locked multiple doors. So why does this verse refer to a single door? Because here it says that they raced and they both met her master لَدَى الْبَابِ, at the door, a single door. If she locked so many doors, why is only one door mentioned here? So what door was it? Most of the mufassirun say that this single door that they raced to and met Aziz at was the door to the room in which Yusuf and Zulaykha were during the attempted seduction. There are multiple rooms in the house. We know this. And according to this interpretation, Yusuf is running to the door to that room. And at that moment, Aziz is at the door, which means he's already in the house. He's not at the front door, outside of the house. He's already inside of the house, at the door to the room in which Yusuf and Zulaykha were in. Right? This is the standard tafsir. So this would imply that for some reason, Aziz came home. It was unexpected. And instead of walking in through the main door and going somewhere else, for some reason, he felt a need to go to that door. And suddenly, as he's making his way to that door, it flings open and he sees Yusuf and Zulaykha in this situation. So it means he either had, you go to the other question. If it's one door and it's to that room and the other doors were locked, how did he get there? So some of the ulama say that it's quite possible that he had the keys to all of these doors, or it's possible, though far-fetched, that the doors locked from the inside but not from the outside. But this is really speculation. Likely he had the keys to all of the doors because he is Rabbul Manzil, he is the Lord of the manor, he is the owner of the house. It's also possible that the door that was opened was the front door to the house of Aziz, containing many other doors. And this would mean that when Yusuf finally reached the external door, he tried to open it to get out of the house. And Zulaykha realized that she had no choice but to tear his shirt to prevent him from leaving the house. So you see different scholars frame it in different ways depending on where the event took place, whether it was inside of the room, at the door to that room, or the door leading outside of the house. And it leads us to another discussion, which is, did she tear the shirt on purpose? Was it something planned in the moment, or is it something that happened inadvertently in the heat of the moment? Now, the word used in the ayah is qaddat qamisahu. So qadda in Arabic means to tear a slit into something. You tear a slit, this is called qadda. What we have here is two scenarios. Either Zulaykha was so eager to seduce Yusuf alayhi salam that as he struggled to get away, she inadvertently tore his shirt in the heat of the moment. It wasn't done on purpose. The second scenario is Yusuf tries to get out of the situation. He runs to the door, whether it's the door to the room or the door to the house leading outside. And in that moment, she purposely tears his shirt as an attempt to prevent him from going outside. This would mean it was planned in the moment to keep him from going out, because if he goes out in that scenario, it would have exposed her. This is one interpretation. Now, both of these interpretations are plausible. However, the standard tafsir is the first position, that the tearing of the shirt was inadvertent. It wasn't on purpose. It was done in the throes of passion as she attempted to seduce him, and wasn't a strategy to keep him from going outside. And it's possible that it was inadvertently done inside of the inner room, and he still made his way to the front door where he met Aziz. So you have different ways of picturing the scenario. Everyone has in their own imagination an image of this event. I don't know how you imagine it. You don't know how I imagine it. We have images in our mind as we hear the story. We may have the image of a room as it might have looked in that time, and what art was on the wall, and how did the beds look, and how were the linens and sheets and pillows and all of these things. You imagine the structure of the house. It's either he was going to the door leading out of the room at which he met Aziz, or he was almost on his way out of the house And at that moment, the door opened and Aziz was standing outside, seeing both Zulaykha and Yusuf in this situation. So, when you get to that part of the story, it says that they raced to the door, whether it's the door to the room or the door leading outside of the house, the front door. وَأَلْفَيَا سَيِّدَهَا لَدَى الْبَابِ. Allah says that they both met her Lord at the door. Now the word used here is al-faya, and al-faya hints at the unexpected nature of Aziz's return. It gives a hint and a subtle indication that it wasn't expected for him to return at that time. And this makes sense considering the steps that Zulaykha took to seduce Yusuf and locking the doors. It's unlikely she thought he would have returned at that moment, because if things had gone her way, fill in the blanks. So he comes to the door, they find him at the door, and it was unexpected. And it's indicated in this verse very subtly that he was suspicious of the situation. He opens the door, and right in front of him is Zulaykha, his wife, and Yusuf alayhi salam. Now Yusuf alayhi salam is not standing in his normal attire. He's standing with either his shirt torn in half from the back, with it falling off of him or hanging off of him, or it's completely off of him and the upper part of his body is completely unclothed. We don't know. But we know the shirt is torn and it's visibly torn. So imagine the Aziz, the husband, opens the door and sees his wife. What is she wearing? She's dressed up. She's perfumed. Meanwhile, he's wearing his normal attire, but the shirt is torn and either hanging off of his body or on the floor. The Aziz knows something is up. And at that moment, Zulaykha starts to speak. Without missing a beat, without a single hesitation, she makes a sort of accusation. But it's a very subtle accusation. She suggests in a very subtle way that Yusuf had intended indecencies with her and sought to draw her near to him. So she made what sounded like a false accusation against Yusuf as soon as she was caught. So look at her response. She says, "What is the punishment of the one who intends evil for your wife other than imprisonment or a painful torment?" Pay very close attention to the language here. She speaks in a very ambiguous way. She says, "What is the punishment of he who intends evil for your wife other than imprisonment or a painful torment?" She doesn't say explicitly, "What is the punishment for the one who attempts to rape or seduce your wife?" She just says, "Man arada bi ahlika su'an," whoever wants evil for your wife. And this indicates something, that she is not able to accuse him of a direct crime. Instead, she accuses him of intending evil. And look at what she does. If you go to ayah 24, what does Allah say about her? وَلَقَدْ هَمَّتْ بِهِ. Allah says that certainly she had desire for him. So she is indirectly accusing Yusuf alayhi salam of having the same hem for her that she had for him in this moment. So she can't accuse him of a direct crime, but she makes this subtle accusation. And immediately after this false accusation, she tries to put forth a kind of order or command to the husband, suggesting what should be done to subtly pressure him to do something about this, to put the attention on Yusuf and doing something to Yusuf, to take attention away from her. And she says, what is the reward or the consequence of someone who intends evil with your wife except a painful punishment, or imprisonment, or a painful punishment? So now we get to the awesomeness that is this story and the linguistic complexity and all of the shades of meaning. When you come to this verse, this part of the verse, Al-Imam Al-Razi, he says that this phrase, مَا جَزَاءُ مَنْ أَرَادَ بِأَهْلِكَ سُوءًا, the ma can be a ma of questioning, or it can be a ma of negation. There's over a dozen possible meanings for ma in Arabic. One of them is a questioning, an istifham. Masmuka, what is your name? Right? Ma dinuka, what is your deen? What? So what is the reward or consequence for the one who desires evil for your wife? That's the standard meaning of this phrase. But Imam Al-Razi says that there's another possible way of reading this. You can also read it as a negation, meaning there is to be no reward for the person who intends evil for your wife except imprisonment or painful punishment. Now, in either case, it is suggesting that he is imprisoned or that he suffers a punishment. Because even in the question, it's a rhetorical question. It's in that is a suggestion of what to do to Yusuf alayhi salam. So this leads us to that question I put forth earlier. If she is so in love with Yusuf, if she is so enamored with him, why would she suggest imprisonment or a painful punishment for Yusuf? And number two, why does she mention imprisonment or a painful punishment? Why not just imprisonment? Why not just a painful punishment? What's the difference between the two? Why mention the two at all? So when we go to Imam Al-Razi, he mentions something very powerful. He says that Zulaykha was so infatuated with Yusuf alayhi salam that she mentioned imprisonment first and punishment last, because, as he said, if you love someone, you wouldn't want to hurt them. And this indicates that when she says imprisonment, she only means for a day or a part of a day. No one should understand that she is suggesting that he face life in prison, because this is not according to the style of the Quran, for there are other verses in the Quran that do mention the meaning of life imprisonment, and it doesn't come in this manner of phrasing. We have in Surah Al-Shu'ara the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He mentions the statement of Fir'aun to Musa. This is much later on in the history when Musa alayhi salam confronts Fir'aun. Fir'aun says to Musa, لَإِنِ اتَّخَذْتَ إِلَهًا غَيْرِي لَأَجْعَلَنَّكَ مِنَ الْمَسْجُونِينَ. If you take a God besides me, I will certainly make you among the masjunin, the imprisoned ones. And this means those who are imprisoned for life, who are put away forever, throw away the key. That's the Quranic phrase referring to life imprisonment. So the ulama say that when she says, إِلَّا أَن يُسْجَنَ, this is in a passive form as well. It only means a day or a part of a day. And the painful punishment, it doesn't even specify. So what exactly is she suggesting, and what's the purpose of this? What we can say is to draw attention away from her own actions. Very clearly, she doesn't want to be under the suspicion of trying to seduce Yusuf alayhi salam. So she projects this onto him to take attention away from her own actions. Now, Imam Al-Razi goes on to say that when she tried to seduce him and Yusuf alayhi salam refused, and he didn't even refuse in a passive way. He refused very forcefully. He said, Ma'adallah. And he took steps to get out of there. When she saw that response, she grew even more certain of his purity and his dignity and honor, and grew even more in love with him and more infatuated with him than she was before the attempted seduction. So, notice that out of this feeling, because of that increase in attachment, because of his response and the certainty of his dignity and honor and purity, she actually felt too ashamed to make a direct accusation against him. Notice that she doesn't actually accuse him of anything. If you pay attention to the verse, nowhere does she say he did anything. She just said, what's the reward or the consequence of the one who desires evil for your family, for your wife? She doesn't say what the evil is. She doesn't mention the name of Yusuf. It's so indirect and ambiguous, it's not even a direct accusation. And Imam al-Razi says that's because she was too ashamed to make a direct accusation against him. She couldn't lie against him. She didn't even tell a lie. She used a kind of ta'arid, a kind of misleading impression, where it gives a certain impression to the listener, but the one saying it intends something different. So it's not an explicit lie, but it's the person who hears it understands something different from the intention of the one saying it. So let's go back to the ayah we covered last week about the ham, this desire. We established in the previous dars that the ham, the desire of Zulaykha, was different from the ham of Yusuf alayhi salam. Now, some people, as we mentioned before, said that Yusuf had the same ham as Zulaykha. And it's just that he was protected. But he had the same desire, and it would have happened. They suggest this. Imam al-Razi, he brings this up in his Tafsir, and he hits back at those people who suggest this. He says, look, the people who accuse Yusuf of having desire for Zulaykha are absolutely shameless, because Zulaykha herself didn't accuse him of desiring her. So if she doesn't accuse him of desiring her, how are you going to come later on and shamelessly say that he had the same desire as her? She was too ashamed to say that, and they have no shame in saying that. So that itself is a proof, the fact that she doesn't make that claim. So Imam al-Razi also suggests that in using this indirect and ambiguous wording, she is intending one thing in her heart while giving the impression of something else. What I just mentioned now as ta'arid, this misleading impression. And so according to that interpretation, when she says, مَا جَزَاءُ مَنْ أَرَادَ بِأَهْلِكَ سُوءًا, what is the reward or consequence for the one who desires evil for your wife? According to this, she's using a misleading impression. They think, Aziz thinks, the evil would be an attempted seduction, but she intends his refusal and pushing her away and getting out of the house or getting out of the room. So in her mind, the evil is one thing, but the listener thinks something else. She means something else in her heart, but it gives the impression of something else to the listener. So this is the situation. They're standing at the door. His shirt is halfway off of his body or on the floor. We don't know. And she immediately makes this subtle, ambiguous accusation, but without specifying what exactly happened, but suggesting something bad happened and something should be done. How does Yusuf respond? Allah Ta'ala mentions in the next verse in ayah 26, قَالَ هِيَ رَاوَدَتْنِي عَنْ نَفْسِي وَشَهِدَ شَاهِدٌ مِّنْ أَهْلِهَا إِنْ كَانَ قَمِيصُهُ قُدَّ مِنْ قُبُلٍ فَصَدَقَتْ وَهُوَ مِنَ الْكَاذِبِينَ وَإِنْ كَانَ قَمِيصُهُ قُدَّ مِنْ دُبُرٍ فَكَذَبَتْ وَهُوَ مِنَ الصَّادِقِينَ. This is verse 26 and 27. So Yusuf responds, she tried to seduce me. She was very ambiguous, he was very explicit. She tried to seduce me. And then Allah Ta'ala says, and a witness from her own folk bore witness, saying, if his shirt was torn from the front, then she has spoken the truth, and he is one of the liars. And if his shirt is torn from behind, then she has told a lie, and he is one of the truthful. Who started it all? It was Zulaykha. She initiated the attempted seduction. And she is the one who spoke first when Aziz opened the door. But when she said what she said, Yusuf alayhi salam immediately responded. The lesson here is, you don't have to respond to false accusations. If someone accuses you of something, you don't have to respond to it if it's false. but you are allowed to. And we see here Yusuf is, one could say, a position of weakness relative to the situation. And he responds to the accusation saying that she tried to seduce him. Though later on in his story, he's accused later on by his brothers of having been a thief. But he doesn't respond to that one because he had power then. So he responds to this. And he responds to an ambiguous accusation with direct and specific reply of, she tried to seduce me. He didn't reply with equally ambiguous words. In these situations, what is required is clarity, not vagueness. And we see the clarity of his statement. He did not say it in an ambiguous way. He did not allude to it in a passive sense. He said, "Hiya rawadatni an nafsi." She tried to seduce me. So now Aziz, the husband, is faced with two competing claims. On the one hand, his wife is suggesting that Yusuf tried to seduce her. And here is Yusuf, whom he knows very well and has intimate experience with, is saying, she tried to seduce me. What is he supposed to do? We are in the age of the Me Too movement. And we must not forget that due process and verification are absolutely paramount to justice. According to some statistics, over 26% of sexual assault accusations are actually false or unfounded. Now, the stats on this are highly politicized, and you'll find different stats depending on where you look, because people have agendas for under-reporting that or over-reporting that. So you have to do a little bit of digging and looking at the data, but according to the most accurate research that we can find, around 26% of all sexual assault and rape accusations are actually either false or unfounded. So it's not that we believe all women or believe all men, but we have to investigate all situations, right? So Aziz walks into this situation and he has to confirm his wife and deny Yusuf, or confirm Yusuf and deny his wife. What is he going to do? This is very shocking for him to walk in on this and hear these two things. So what does he do? It appears that Aziz sought to have a third person investigate the claims, to weigh the conflicting accounts, and advise on who is telling the truth and who is lying. And this itself indicates that he's feeling a little suspicious about his wife. Because if the husband feels great loyalty from his wife, the default response would be to believe the wife. But the fact that he doesn't immediately believe his own wife indicates that he already had some suspicions. And as we'll see, he had more than just suspicions. He had numerous qara'in, numerous circumstantial evidence indicating that she is the guilty party and Yusuf is innocent, as we'll see. So, what are these qara'in? Aziz obviously hears the testimony of this shahid that we're going to look at in a moment. But as he opens the door and sees his wife and sees Yusuf in this situation, he hears both claims. One says that he tried to seduce her in a very passive, ambiguous way. He explicitly denies that by saying that she tried to seduce him. Aziz had to go by what they said as well as the circumstantial evidence. And this is what we call qara'in in Arabic. What are the qara'in that we see in this situation? Imam al-Razi mentions, number one, Yusuf alayhi salam is in the role of a servant. He's not really a servant in the sense of being beneath Aziz in his real maqam, but his position in the society was that of a servant. And in that culture, and in virtually every culture where you had servants, it's virtually unheard of for a servant to try and seduce the master's wife. It's exceedingly rare. That's number one. Number two, Yusuf alayhi salam was trying very hard to leave the house. When Aziz opens the door, Yusuf is trying to get out. Aziz saw him as if he's trying to get out. So if he's trying to seduce Zulaykha, why is he running out of the house like this? With her following behind him. It's not as if she's running in the opposite direction. She's running right behind him because Al-Faya Sayyidaha Ladal Bab. They both met him at the door. She's coming behind. Number three, Aziz and the witness with him saw Zulaykha had adorned herself, had perfumed herself, while Yusuf is wearing his ordinary house clothes and was not dressed up. There was nothing in his appearance to indicate that he was trying to adorn himself to win her over and be with her in that manner. Number four, Aziz has a history with Yusuf. Over 10 years. There's a collective experience of his character, of his trustworthiness, of his loyalty, of his modesty and dignity. So, there's nothing in the character of Yusuf and no past experience that would hint at or indicate him ever inclining to do such a thing. That's another circumstantial proof. And number five, when he opens the door, Zulaykha is the first one to speak, but what she says is very vague. She doesn't mention a crime. She doesn't even mention Yusuf's name. Meanwhile, Yusuf is very explicit. Rawadatni an nafsi. She tried to seduce me. And furthermore, when you look in the Tafsir reports, it mentions that Aziz was of an age and condition where he was unable to fulfill his wife. So he knows that in himself. He knows their personal business and realizes that as an unfulfilled wife, it's more likely she would have taken those kinds of steps in that environment and not the other way around. And these are just some of the qara'in, the circumstantial evidence pointing to Yusuf's innocence. But Aziz was too ashamed to say anything directly. In the moment, he hears Zulaykha, he hears Yusuf, and in the background, he has all of this circumstantial evidence, but he still hasn't said anything. He's quiet. But in that very moment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought forth a witness. وَشَهِدَ شَاهِدٌ مِّنْ أَهْلِهَا. Allah mentions that a witness from her own folk bore witness. So who is this witness? What do we know about this person or thing? There's three opinions in the books of Tafsir. One of them is far-fetched, the other one is quite weak, and the third one is the strongest view on the matter of the identity of the witness. When we go to the books of Tafsir, we find that there are narrations which state that the witness was Zulaykha's paternal cousin, who was known as a hakim, a wise man, a sage. And it just happened to be that Aziz was walking with her paternal cousin and they were going into the house to take care of some kind of business as this event unfolded. So the witness is a bystander watching this conversation, and he is the one who bears witness with the suggestion of how to determine who is the guilty party and who is the innocent party through another piece of what is ultimately circumstantial evidence, the tearing or the slit in the shirt, whether it's from the front or from the back. The second opinion about the witness is from Ibn Abbas, and it's also related from Sa'id bin Jubair and Al-Dhahak, that the witness was a baby who spoke from the cradle. Yes, it would have been a baby from another servant or someone working within the household, because we know that Aziz and Zulaykha were childless. So this baby belonged to someone else. So according to this narration, it mentions that there were four infants that spoke from the cradle. Isa alayhi salam, the infant born to the prostitute who spoke declaring the innocence of Jurayj, which is in the hadith in Sahih Muslim, and then the baby of a woman who used to comb the hair of Fir'aun's daughter, and the witness for Yusuf. This is according to the narration here. Now, this is not actually a hadith. So there are some people who say it's a hadith, but it's not a hadith that is raised to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It is, according to the sanad itself, it's the statement of a Sahabi, Ibn Abbas. But there's a question about the authenticity of this narration. It is weakened by many. Therefore, it's not really admissible on account of the weakness of the chain. Furthermore, when you look at the meaning conveyed by it, it doesn't really match with what is told to us in the verse. Because, think about it, if it was a baby, its mere speaking would be such a miracle that all it would need to say is Yusuf is innocent. It wouldn't need to point to something that is circumstantial evidence. Its mere speaking would be a higher level of certainty than any evidence based on the area where the shirt has been slit. Because even that is circumstantial. That, whether it's slit from the front or the back, it's circumstantial evidence in favor of one or the other. It's still dhanni, ultimately. It's still speculative. But you add it to the list of circumstantial evidence. Now, the baby speaking, that would be a miracle. Something completely out of the ordinary. And that alone would give certainty to the statement of the baby, Yusuf is innocent. Just like with Jurayj, right? And therefore, we say that this narration is not sound, and it conflicts with the basic meaning of the verse and what is indicated. Because what we see in the verse is the witness is suggesting a step to ascertain via circumstantial evidence who is lying and who is telling the truth between Zulaykha and Yusuf. And we see that in this verse Allah says, وَشَهِدَ شَاهِدٌ مِّنْ أَهْلِهَا, a witness from her own folk. And there's significance in that because it indicates that this witness is not going to be biased against her. This witness, because it's from her family, has her interest in mind, but is wise as well. It's not a biased witness supporting Yusuf against her. It's from her own family. So that's the second view, that it was the infant. And the third opinion, which is very far-fetched, is attributed to the early Mufassir Mujahid, who said that the witness was the shirt. But it doesn't make sense how the shirt can be a witness when it says that the shahid is from her family. That doesn't really fit the way the verse explains the situation, because it is an immaterial, inanimate object, and it doesn't say anything about the shirt speaking. So this is very far-fetched. So we say the first view is the most reasonable and apparent view, that the witness was the paternal cousin of Zulaykha, and because he's a family member, he is not biased against her. And he sees the situation unfold and makes this suggestion. Now, as a witness, he's not really a witness in the sense that he saw something happen between Zulaykha and Yusuf. And his task is rather to establish the reason for the tear in the shirt. What is the reason? If the reason is an attempted seduction, it would be from the front. And if it was him fleeing, then it would be torn in the back. This is what he was getting at. And it implies that in that moment, whether the shirt is hanging off of Yusuf alayhi salam or on the floor, that he wasn't aware of where exactly the slit is located. He can't tell based on the position of the shirt whether it's on the back or on the front. So he suggests if it's from the back, then he's telling the truth and she's a liar. If it's from the front, then she's telling the truth and he's a liar. And this was his suggestion. So when they went to investigate we know what happened. They found the slit from the back. And we said earlier that this, according to the majority, was not done on purpose. It's something she did in the throes of passion, and it wasn't a deliberate way to keep him from leaving the house, though some have suggested that. And we see here also the power of circumstantial evidence, that the collective weight of circumstantial evidence is in favor of Yusuf being innocent and Zulaykha being the guilty party. And the witness suggests another piece of circumstantial evidence. And this shows us that the witness was not a baby, because had it been a baby, as we said, the mere fact that it speaks from the cradle, it could have said Yusuf is innocent, and that would have far more weight than all of the circumstantial evidence combined. So, inshallah, we have to stop here, because the next part unfolds so many things that we simply can't do them justice in the time that remains today. So what we want to examine now as the story moves along is, number one, what did they discover when they examined the shirt? Number two, we want to look at what it means when it says, this is certainly the plotting of women. What does that mean? Is that misogynistic? What is intended there? We also want to look at the counsel that was given to Yusuf when he was exonerated. Who gave the counsel and why? We also want to look at the counsel given to Zulaykha after she was found guilty. And we want to answer some other questions, such as, why did Aziz stay married to her after all of this? Why did he remain with her after this? And we want to look at what happens when the news of her attempted seduction leaks and spreads through the town and reaches other women. And we'll examine Zulaykha striking back after the gossip spread through the town. And then we go through the story to the part where he is imprisoned. So we are now making our way to the next shift in the story, where Yusuf reaches this critical moment in his life where he is imprisoned. So probably after next class we'll be talking about the imprisonment, inshaAllah ta'ala. Wallahu rasuluhu a'lam, wa sallallahu wa sallama ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So if there's any questions, we can take a few, inshaAllah. Go ahead.
So, I'm about to forget. The word, it looks like it seems to be obviously a theme, the word nurawidu, rawadathu.
Right.
I hear it a lot.
Right.
We see it a lot in Surah Yusuf.
Right.
There's got to be a reason for that, because it's seduction in the sense of Zulaykha, but then his brothers say that about getting Benyamin or nurawidu abana,
Right.
So that seems to be a theme with that word.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Well, there's a sense of continuity within Surah Yusuf, that the same verb is used in different contexts. So is used for different purposes, but it has the same shared meaning. Now, murawada in original Arabic, in Fusha, is mutalaba, essentially. It is to avidly seek something. And mutalaba also indicates a process. There are steps taken to obtain what one is seeking. So in murawada, in the story of Zulaykha with Yusuf, there is a process in the attempted seduction, right? It's not a one-time affair. It's taking place over many stages leading up to that moment in the room. And this is how it is used, right? When he responds, he says very clearly that she is the one who did that. Rawadatni an nafsi. She is the one who took these steps over time to seduce me. It's not something done just in the moment. There's some plotting, there's some planning, there's forethought into the steps that are taken to achieve one's aim. And that's all embedded, if you will, in the meaning of that phrase, murawada.
And the word itself would be considered a neutral word. It doesn't have a negative or a positive connotation. Is that correct?
In and of itself, no, it doesn't have a negative connotation. There are other ways you could express that reality that are more explicit. And in the Quran, Allah doesn't use the more explicit terms. He uses the more open-ended terms because that is the purpose of the story, is to relay the moral lessons, not to get into the intimate details, using the most possibly intimate words in Arabic to convey that meaning, right? And this is why you have in Arabic and other languages this idea of kinaya, this metonym, where you use words to allude to things without using direct words for them. So a very simple example, if someone says, I have to go to the restroom, they don't mean they just have to go and open the door and stand inside. It means they have to relieve themselves. But instead of saying, I have to go relieve myself, they say, I have to go to the restroom. That's a kinaya, if you will, for the act of emptying one's bowels, if you will. So this is similar in that way, that instead of using a more explicit word, Allah uses a more open-ended word that can be used in a variety of ways.
Well, for the second question I have, Sheikh, is obviously we've mentioned multiple. There's nothing is placed or said by accident by Allah Subhanahu wa Taala in the Quran. So it's interesting how he said وَشَهِدَ شَاهِدٌ مِنْ أَهْلِهَا. He could have said وَشَهِدَ رَجُلٌ مِنْ أَهْلِهَا. Right.
And in reality, this person wasn't a shahid in the sense that he didn't witness the attempted seduction. If he had witnessed the attempted seduction, he would be, legally speaking, a shahid, a legal witness in a case. So what he's witnessing is a way of establishing via circumstantial evidence who is the guilty party and who is the innocent party. There's a sense also of emphasis, because when you have this repetition in between the verb and the subject, or the co-sharing of the verb and the subject, there's often a sense of emphasis there, right? وَضَرَبَ ضَارِبٌ وَأَكَلَ آكِلٌ, right? وَذَهَبَ ذَاهِبٌ. You know, there ate an ater, there struck a striker, there witnessed a witnessed. There's a sense of this person appearing, taking on a very important role in that moment. What would have happened if he wasn't there? Allahu A'lam. This person played a very important role in establishing that she was the guilty party and he was innocent. Even though Aziz had in the back of his mind all of the other circumstantial proofs to Yusuf's innocence, all the things that Imam al-Razi listed out, the past experiences with Sayyidina Yusuf, the circumstances at which he met Yusuf by the door, the circumstances in which he saw his wife Zulaykha right behind him, how they were dressed, what was their demeanor, how did she respond when the door was opened? She used ambiguous words, she wasn't very clear, she perhaps was flustered in the moment and didn't expect him to be there. So she said this while Yusuf a.s. spoke in very clear terms, saying that she tried to seduce me. All of that, plus his own personal, intimate knowledge about him, his circumstance, his relationship with his wife, and the tensions there, all of that led him to have this notion that things were not okay here, things were suspicious, but he still wasn't able to take a stance and say, I don't buy this. It wasn't until the witness stepped in. So there's something psychologically going on with Aziz. And we're going to examine that next week, because despite all the circumstantial evidence, despite what the witness states and what they discover, Aziz didn't divorce her. He stayed with her. So we have to examine why. And I mean, there's a lot of different answers. But you have to remember, him being the Aziz, he has a position of authority. He has to avoid scandal.
But
So
you don't think that Zulaykha might have been slightly vindictive because he denied her advances at all? Because couldn't have she just said, it's okay, he seduced me, but let it go? it's okay, I forgive him.
Well, we're going to examine all of this stuff next week when we look at what they say to her and what was going on in her own story. Because that's a loose end. We are going to have to tie up that loose end at some point.
Because she could have flat out
We'll either tie it up in the next class or we tie it up before he goes to prison. What happened to Zulaykha at the end of the day after all this? Her story ends within Surah Yusuf, but with the details that occurred afterwards that are not mentioned in the Quran. We want to tie off those loose ends by examining what was going on with her. What was her mental state? What are the narrations? What do they say about her and what she did afterwards and what happened with Aziz later on? And did she or did she not get married to Yusuf and what came about through that? So we're going to answer those questions, inshallah.
So my question, coming back to the...
question.
Go ahead. You go ahead.
Go ahead. Did I interrupt you? I'm sorry.
No, I didn't realize you had one, so...
Oh,
Can I ask quickly? Because
sure.
my question is coming back to the witness again.
Mhm.
So if witness has access to the circumstantial evidence, Aziz should have the same access, right?
Mhm.
That circumstantial evidence.
Yeah.
Why was the presence of a witness necessary to establish that evidence?
It's either due to the intimacy or the closeness of Aziz to the wife and the fact that it's his wife and him not being able to exercise as much objectivity as a third party. It could be his psychological state. It could be something that didn't occur to him in the moment because he was so shocked at what he saw from his wife and from Yusuf. It took this third party to bring to his attention something that was on the surface quite obvious, but he missed it in the moment because of the emotions. These are all possible reasons why he didn't think to use that as another circumstantial evidence to determine who's truthful and who's lying. The witness is making a suggestion, and then they do examine the shirt and they come to that result and finding out who is the guilty party. So we have to talk about the psychological state of Aziz a little bit next week, because one does wonder, how does he stay on after all of this, and what happened in that relationship? How did it end? What came of Zulaykha after the other women? When she is told to seek forgiveness from whom? She wasn't a believer at the time. So there's a lot of little questions that we have to answer to understand better the state of Aziz, the way he was thinking, why he stayed on. When Yusuf alayhi salam was told to turn away from this, what was meant by that? When she was told to seek forgiveness, from whom? And if it was from Allah, then how does that make sense if she's a mushrika at the time? There's a lot of things we have to explore.
Can we definitively say the shahid was with Al-Aziz عندما ألفيا سيدها لدى الباب? So that the shahid must have been there as well.
Yes.
But it's just not mentioned because it's more important that it was about Al-Aziz at that time, correct?
Well, the fact that it mentions them as a shahid indicates that he's not witnessing the attempted seduction.
Right.
He's witnessing the situation unfold and the ensuing discussion and dispute about who is the guilty party versus who is the innocent party. So what is he bearing witness to? Not to the event, but he's bearing witness to ways of establishing the truth in that situation, indicating that he is with the Aziz, he is with him to attend some business, and they were going into the house together when this all unfolded.
It wasn't he didn't just show up secondarily at the same time or something.
There's no indication of that. Yeah.
That's what I want to know. Jazakallah khair.
I just have a question about the culture or religion of people of that time.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that they believed or practiced sanctity of marriage. Zulaykha, in trying to do whatever she was trying to do,
Mm-hmm.
knew what she was doing was wrong.
Right.
So there was sanctity of marriage.
Right.
And fornication was something that they must have considered wrong.
Even in
Following,
even in societies where they're very loose in their sexual morality, even in those societies, it's commonly agreed that in those societies, through marriage, that is a no-no. you don't commit infidelity, even if outside of marriage people are very relaxed with those, with their morality as it concerns men and women. We do know that they had marriage as an institution in that society. It doesn't mean that it's the only form of marriage or the only way they would consecrate relationships, because the term nikah or marriage can mean different things in different societies. What we understand from this story is that it was a standard kind of marriage where there is this union between the husband and the wife, this commitment to fidelity, where the sanctity of marriage was upheld. It doesn't mean that there was not other forms of marriage, because this is something that we have in different cultures, in Jahili periods as well. There were different arrangements made between men and women besides the standard marriage contract, even if those other arrangements were contractual. I mean, even technically, prostitution is a contractual relationship, right? This is something that a lot of people don't like to hear. It's a very bitter pill to swallow for people in modern society, that prostitution is an offer and an acceptance and an exchange of money for a temporary moment of pleasure. That is closer to marriage than boyfriend-girlfriend open-ended relationships. So that means that in terms of Sharia, between the boyfriend and the girlfriend that are sleeping with each other in zina, and the prostitute and the John, the prostitute and John are actually closer to something resembling a marriage, as haram as it is, than the boyfriend-girlfriend arrangement, because it's still contractual. And nikah is an aqd, it's a contract. It's a ijab and qubul, an exchange of a mahar, and it's open-ended, meaning it's not for a temporary period. It is open. It's with the intention of remaining. So it doesn't mean that their ways of marriage were identical to ours, but they did have a basic arrangement of marriage that is shared through societies. And that's the relationship of Zulaykha and Aziz, from what we can tell. Yeah.
Do we have a rough age of how old Zulaykha was versus an Aziz?
I haven't come across anything about the age. I don't know. Maybe something out there. But these things, the Quran itself doesn't detail these things about the age very rarely when there's a purpose behind it, such as the age of Sayyidina Nuh, for instance. But in those finer details, we find that in the Tafsir. Sometimes we find it in the Tafsir, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we'll find those in the Isra'iliyat that make their way into the Tafsir, but they're not really that strong from an evidentiary basis. So I haven't come across anything about the age. But that doesn't mean that there's not something out there in the Turath that mentions the age. I just haven't seen it.
Well, the only reason I mention is because, as you said, Aziz may have gotten to an age where he potentially could not perform his marital obligation.
Yeah, and that shows up in the story from the Isra'iliyat that have made their way into the books of Tafsir. It has prominent mention in the books of Tafsir, and it's used as a way to explain some of the motives of Zulaykha, as well as the motives of Aziz in not divorcing her and getting rid of her. And from what we can tell, because of his position as the Aziz, this minister, this very powerful person in Egyptian society, he didn't want this news to get out. And this is not uncommon at all with politicians and people of power, that they may face some family crisis or scandal and they don't want it to get out because it reflects on them and they have a public position and reputation to uphold. And that's the basic explanation for why he didn't divorce her. A lot of times these politicians, they stay married because if you're the politician, you have to be married to keep up the image, even if there's a crisis in the household and things aren't that good. So this is a common theme with people of power throughout the ages. Wallahu a'lam. Wa iyyakum. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.